Välkommen och god dag allesammen. Welcome back to the channel where we use the actual historical sources to look at Norse paganism, and today we're talking about the gods. So as you know, if you've watched some of my other videos, our pagan ancestors did not believe the gods were lifelike superhuman beings that were just lurking around the world and involved with us and watching everything we do. All the gods in the myths represent different aspects of nature, the spirit, and the cosmos. This is pretty universally agreed upon by the experts, and I have a whole playlist on my channel where I look at all the evidence and the theories that these people have about exactly what the gods represent. That is in the link in the description. However, there is one problem to this way of thinking, and that is that we have a couple of sources from medieval times that actually do say the gods were real people. They say that the gods were actually real and they were the ancestors of the medieval Scandinavians, and they wrote in their records that due to the pagan people's stupidity and ignorance, they started to worship their own ancestors as gods. So this was what a few sources say, not many, just a few here, but I'm going to go over them. Don't forget that these sources are written by Christians a couple hundred years after pagan times. They're not super reliable, and they wrote, with a very clear bias, trying to make their pagan ancestors sound stupid and ignorant and make Christianity the all-accepted universal religion. But anyway, in this video, I'm going to look at what these sources say and what these could mean. So there's about 3 only from medieval times that say the gods were real people. 2 of them are by the famous Snorri Sturluson. One is in the Prose Edda, in the Gylfangning section, which I'm going to go over here. So I'm not going to go into all of this in so much detail because it'll take forever. I'm just going to give a quick summary of what Snorri says about this in the Prose Edda first in his intro. Snorri writes how the gods descended from the Trojans, actually, like the Trojan horse that we all know in Greece. Or, more specifically, he says that they descend from the Thracians, which are from this area right around here. And now, before any of you start talking, this area thousands of years ago is not the same as it is today. Every time I see people discover this and I see people talking about this, I see a couple of assholes talking like, oh, the Norse gods are Muslim, your gods are a bunch of brown, dark Arabs. I hear every time some idiots say that. Look, people from this area at the time of Troy were pagan and they worshipped the Greek gods, actually. And also, at this time, they would have looked very Nordic. I mean, geez, if you go back just a few hundred years ago, there were many people in this region that had light hair and light eyes. They looked pretty Nordic. If you go back a few thousand years, they would have looked very Nordic. So I'm not saying that the Norse gods came from this area, because that is not even close to believable. But even if they did, they would have probably been pretty Nordic-looking Greek pagans, actually, like we see in historical records, like how the Greeks looked around that time. Just had to get that point out of the way because there's always some idiot that wants to talk about that. Anyway, if we start with King Priam, that's where Snorri says it all starts. He was the Trojan king, like you know from the movie Troy, you've probably seen, and his daughter, and she married another king, and they gave birth to Thor, actually. And then Thor found a woman, and they had many children, and one of his sons was called Frialaf, and his other son was Woden, or Odin. So in this story, actually, told by Snorri in his intro to the Prose Edda, Thor is actually the grandfather of Odin. Then it tells how Odin migrated from this area to Germany, and how he started spreading his royal seed from there. And then it tells about how his son Baldur ruled the Franks, and all of the Frankish ruling class descend from Baldur. And his other son, Skjoldr, ruled the Danes, and they all descend from him. But then Odin moved up to Sweden, where he met a king that was ruling there called Gylfi, and that is what the next section of the Prose Edda, Gylfangning, is about, which I will go over in just a moment. But eventually Odin replaces Gylfi as king of the Swedes, and then Odin, with his son Yngvi, which is where the Yngling name comes from, like Ynglinga Saga, And then Odin finally goes to Norway, and he puts his son Samingr as king there in Norway. And this leads into the section called Gylfaginning. And Gylfaginning, all it is basically a dialogue between the Swedish king Gylfi when Odin first came into Sweden. And he's always getting tricked by magic, by the Aesir and Odin, and the whole rest of the story. Pretty much Gylfi is just asking different forms of Odin about creation and Ragnarök and all the other myths that you have heard of. So we know that most of this is not super reliable, but how much of it is bullshit and how much of it is true? And why would Snorri make any of this up? So there's a lot to dissect there, and I'm going to do that later in this video, but I do want to say something about the timeline. If this is true, and the Aesir did descend from the king Priam in the Trojan War time, that would put this migration to Scandinavia right at about 3,000 years ago. We're not quite sure if the Trojan War actually happened or if King Priam actually existed. It's debated, but if it is true, scholars date it right to around 1200 BC, and that kind of lines up with some archaeological evidence we have that says there was a migration to Germany and Scandinavia at the time, and technological developments in the Bronze Age, but it's all a bit fuzzy and it's definitely debated, so we're not quite sure. We also know that they did trade with the Greeks at that time, so it's hard to say if the things found in archaeological finds were just from trade or if it was actually migration, so we don't know. Second mention, like I said, is Ynglinga Saga by Snorri Sturluson also, and this is the story of the dynasty and ancestry of the Norwegian kings. So in here, Snorri explains how the gods came from Asgard and settled in Scandinavia in prehistoric times. So Asgard was in Asaland, so Asia, directly translated. And Snorri describes that the Aesir came from a place north of the land of the Turks and south of a barren, frozen wasteland. So this would put the Aesir as being from the Caucasus mountain area, somewhere around here. So it's not Troy, as he says in the Prose Edda. So he kind of directly contradicts himself in the Prose Edda. He says that they're from Troy. In Ynglinga Saga, he says that they're from around the Caucasus mountain area. So then anyway, he speaks about how Odin was the ruler of these people and how he and the rest of the Aesir migrated north all the way to Sweden because of conflict with the Byzantine Empire. So the timeline here doesn't quite add up at all. The Byzantine Empire is just the Eastern Roman Empire after the fall of the Roman Empire as a whole, so this would have started right around the year 400 AD. And by this time, the people in Scandinavia were already worshipping the Norse gods. We know that for sure. So the gods couldn't have migrated to Scandinavia at that time. Then Snorri also tells us in Ynglinga Saga that the Aesir and their amazing legends that we hear in the Norse myths, and eventually how the god Freyr founded the Yngling dynasty and became king of Sweden, and then how all of the kings of Norway descend from him. So that's Snorri's two accounts of the gods as actual real people. They're kind of contradicting, and timeline doesn't line up, but anyway, I'll come back to that in a sec. I'll just get on to the third source right now, and that is in Gesta Danorum, or History of the Danes by Saxo Grammaticus. And this one is a lot like Ynglinga Saga. It traces back a long time of lineage and tells about the kings of the Danish ruling dynasty. So this is a very long book, and I don't have time to summarize all of it. I'll do it another time. But basically in here, the gods aren't as close as they are in Snorri's works, and in here they're kind of painted in an evil, mischievous way, actually. So in Snorri's works, the royal family of Sweden and Norway is descended from the gods. In Gesta Danorum, the gods are just kind of people that are involved within the history of Denmark and cause a lot of chaos, quite frankly. One example is that Odin teaches warfare to the Danish king Harald, but then he kills Harald soon after and takes him to Valhalla. Another example in here is that Balder and Hoder, who they were rival suitors of a princess from Norway, Nanna, like we know from the myths, all of those names. And all of the gods fought over her, but eventually Balder was killed and Hoder was able to get her. So this story is quite a bit different than the main myth that we know of Balder, Nanna, and Hoder. So you can see my link about that in the description below. There are a couple of other smaller works that portray the gods as real people that go into a tiny bit of detail, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, who says Balder is an ancestor of some of the ruling families in England. Also a work called Chronicon Letrense. And here Hoder was a king of the Saxons, and he killed Balder and some other gods. So there are definitely a couple of smaller works that depict the gods as real humans, but most of these are written off by historians as inaccurate at best. So like I said, there are a couple of these small examples here and there, but I have gone over the three that were give the most details of the gods as being real humans. But really, the most reliable and detailed source on the gods is in Snorri's works, the Prose Edda and Ynglinga Saga. Even though these are mostly bullshit, there's at least some truth to a lot of this, or perhaps even hidden messages in these stories, like some scholars have suggested. Also, in Snorri's works, it's easier to see where the line is drawn between truth and bullshit, whereas as other texts I mentioned in Gesta Danorum or the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, they just kind of blend myth and reality together in pretty random ways, and without much evidence for their accuracy. Anyway, those are the examples of the gods listed as real humans from the sources. It's time to get on to the main point of this video. It seems as though there was definitely some belief later on after pagan times that the gods were real people at one time. So the question is, why would the authors be writing all of this garbage? And is there any truth to it actually? And if there is truth to it, what is the explanation? And where does that line of myth cross reality? Those are all difficult questions, and there are many theories about all of these. Lots of scholars and historians are trying to make sense of it all. One theory is that the Christian authors, such as Snorri and Saxo, wanted to document the gods as real people so that pagans would realize that they were worshipping fake gods and would be easier to convert them from Christianity. Another theory is that kings were kind of just really assholes around this time, that they were forcing Christianity very harshly and cruelly upon the pagans, and maybe the authors wrote that now the Christianized ruling families descended from the gods. This would, again, it would help Christianize the native pagans. It would have been kind of a propaganda saying like, hey, your king's ancestor was a god that your ancestors used to worship, and now the king is Christian, so you should convert too. And that's just one theory. Another one is that some of these Christian writers, especially Snorri, they were sympathetic with pagan beliefs, and that people were still following pagan beliefs at the time, but they were losing the understanding of their myths, and Snorri wanted to write about these to help keep it alive. We do know that Snorri was a bit bothered that people were losing the understanding of the kennings and metaphors in the traditional Norse poetry, so he does admit that he writes the Prose Edda mainly because of this. He writes it because people were starting to lose their understanding of their own poetry. So Snorri was Christian, maybe not pagan, but he was just a big fan of poetry and wanted to keep that old tradition alive. Fourth theory, some people think that these Christian authors didn't quite know what they were writing about. They had heard the pagan myths, but didn't really know what they actually represented, and that's why they wrote down the myths that they heard, but they didn't quite know what they were represented, so they didn't quite know what they were writing down. As most of you know, some of the myths represent events in nature. Some of them represent rituals, some of them represent different aspects of the spirit, so it is very possible that even though the Christian authors knew these myths very well, that they had no idea what these actually meant, so that they just inserted them into parts of a country's history that kind of loosely fits the storyline. Fifth theory, some scholars think that the authors, especially Snorri, knew exactly what he was talking about, and some even go as far to say that Snorri was secretly a pagan, and he wrote down these myths in a kind of hidden code so they would be allowed to survive. In medieval times, the church would have pretty much burned any trace of pagan literature and killed anyone who practiced it. So it is very possible that Snorri knew this, and he wrote these myths as if they were ancestors on purpose. The church would not have allowed anyone to write about pagan beliefs or practices, but the church would have allowed literature to be written by about their ancestors. So it is very possible that Snorri wrote in this way, depicting the gods as ancestors, specifically so that his literature would be allowed to survive. A final theory, which I've heard from more of the spiritual people out there, is that the gods actually did exist. And really, when you look at the myths, it's not super crazy to suggest that. Many of our myths, like I said, are about spiritual practices, magic, soul journeys, and rituals. And when you look at them, they resemble a lot of magic and shamanic practices that we find in other pagan religions around the world too. You know, a lot of our myths have to do with visions, traveling to the realm of the dead, rebirth, and things like that are very real. So those are some of the things that I believe in, but I don't know if I believe that theory as a whole. But you know, maybe it is possible that the myths are actually about ancient sorcerers and spiritual practices. It's not just one sorcerer, of course, that was called Odin and did all these things by himself in the myths, but perhaps many different people all throughout time that these myths were based upon. Odin does represent the spirit, after all, that can be reincarnated in all of us, so it is very possible that these myths describe different events that people actually did in real life. So that's about all of the scholarly theories that I have read about this. Let me know what you guys think. Have you heard any other theories? Do you have any theories yourselves? I would love to hear in the comments. There is no real easy answer. The reality is it's probably a bit of all of these things. Really, we will not be able to give an educated answer until we examine all the myths together and determine what each one means and represents. And that's what I do on my channel. I have a whole playlist there where I translate the gods' names and speak about their original meanings. That link is in the description below. Well, that's about it for this video. Vi ses nästa gång.